The coffee cup shattered on the floor, and the whole diner went silent for 1 second before the laughter started. Arthur Whitfield sat frozen in his booth, his hands trembling as brown liquid spread across the tile floor near his worn shoes. A group of young men at the counter were already laughing, phones raised, capturing the moment for the world to see. Arthur was 78 years old, dressed in a clean but faded gray coat, and he had done nothing wrong. He had simply reached for his cup at the same moment Tyler Grant, a loud young man in his late 20s, had bumped the table on purpose. Grace Bennett watched from behind the counter, her heart pounding. She had only worked at Miller's Diner for 6 weeks, and she already knew who Tyler Grant was. He came in almost every morning with his 2 friends, ordered expensive breakfasts, tipped well, and treated the staff like servants. Today, though, he had chosen a new target. An old man who came in every single day, alone, and never asked for anything but a cup of coffee and a quiet corner to read his newspaper. Grace grabbed a towel and rushed toward the booth, but before she reached him, she heard Tyler's voice again, sharp and mocking. "Look at him shake," Tyler said to his friends, grinning. "Maybe somebody should get him a bib." The 2 friends laughed. One of them, a heavy-set young man named Kevin, made a shaking motion with his own hands, imitating Arthur. A few other customers chuckled nervously, unsure whether to join in or look away. Nobody said a word in Arthur's defense. The manager, a tired-looking man named Daniel Foss, glanced over from the register but quickly turned back to his work, pretending he had not seen anything at all. Arthur said nothing. He simply reached for a napkin and began wiping the table himself, his eyes fixed downward, his shoulders slightly hunched, as though trying to make himself smaller. He had learned over many years that silence was often safer than speaking up, but today the humiliation cut deeper than usual, and something in his chest tightened painfully. Grace crouched down and quickly wiped up the spilled coffee from the floor, then straightened and looked directly at Tyler. "That's enough," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her stomach. Tyler raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that anyone had spoken back to him. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Grace said. "He didn't do anything to you. Leave him alone." The diner grew quiet again, but this time the silence felt different, heavier, as though everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Tyler smirked and leaned back in his chair, looking around at his friends as if inviting them to laugh with him. "Relax," Tyler said. "We're just having a little fun. Old-timer doesn't mind, do you?" He looked at Arthur, who still had not lifted his eyes from the table. Grace turned to Arthur and gently placed a fresh napkin in front of him, along with a fresh cup of coffee she had already prepared. "Here you go, Mr. Whitfield," she said softly, using the name she had heard the regulars call him. "Take your time, nobody's rushing you." Arthur finally looked up at her, and for a brief moment, Grace saw something in his pale blue eyes that broke her heart. It was not anger. It was not even sadness exactly. It was the look of a man who had simply stopped expecting kindness from strangers and was now surprised to receive it. "Thank you," Arthur whispered, his voice rough from disuse. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Grace said, and she meant it. Tyler and his friends eventually lost interest, turning back to their phones and their food, but the tension in the diner lingered like smoke after a fire. Grace returned to her station behind the counter, her hands still slightly shaking from the confrontation. She had never spoken back to a customer like that before, and part of her worried that Daniel Foss would scold her for it later. But a larger part of her felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt like she had done something right. For the rest of the morning, Grace kept glancing toward Arthur's booth. He sat there for nearly 2 hours, as he did every day, slowly drinking his coffee and reading the same newspaper he always brought with him, though Grace noticed he rarely turned the pages. Sometimes he simply stared out the window at the street outside, watching cars pass, watching people hurry along the sidewalk with places to be and people waiting for them. Arthur had nowhere he needed to be. That was the truth of it. His wife, Margaret, had passed away 3 years ago after a long illness, and since then, the diner had become the only place in his day that felt familiar. His house, once full of her laughter and the smell of her cooking, now felt like an empty shell. He came to the diner not because he was hungry, but because it was the only place where he could sit among other human beings without feeling completely alone. Grace did not know any of this yet. All she knew was that an old man had been humiliated in front of a room full of strangers, and none of those strangers had lifted a finger to help him. Except her. Around noon, as the morning crowd thinned out and the diner grew quieter, Grace found a moment to walk over to Arthur's booth again. She held a small plate with a slice of apple pie. "This is on the house," she said, setting it down in front of him. "You look like you could use something sweet." Arthur blinked in surprise. "I didn't order this." "I know," Grace said with a small smile. "Consider it a gift." Arthur studied her for a moment, as though trying to decide whether to trust this unexpected kindness. Then, slowly, the corners of his mouth lifted into the faintest smile Grace had seen from him all day. "You remind me of my wife," Arthur said quietly. "She used to do things like this, little things. She always said the world needed more little things." Grace felt a lump form in her throat, though she could not fully explain why. "She sounds like she was a wonderful person." "She was," Arthur said, looking down at the pie. "She was everything." Grace wanted to ask more, but she noticed Daniel Foss watching her from across the room, his expression unreadable. She excused herself and returned to work, but she carried the conversation with her for the rest of the day, turning it over in her mind like a smooth stone. That evening, after her shift ended, Grace sat in her small apartment, replaying the morning's events. She thought about Tyler's cruel laughter, about the shattered coffee cup, about the way none of the other customers had said a word. She thought about how easy it would have been for her to also stay silent, to simply clean up the mess and move on, the way everyone else had. But she hadn't, and something about that decision felt important, even if she couldn't yet explain why. She thought, too, about Arthur's words. "You remind me of my wife." There was such tenderness in the way he said it, such deep and quiet grief hidden beneath his calm exterior. Grace had grown up watching her own grandmother grow old and lonely after her grandfather passed away, and she remembered how the world seemed to forget her grandmother existed, how people would speak louder and slower to her, as though age had made her invisible instead of simply older. Grace decided, without fully realizing she was making a decision at all, that she would not let the same thing happen to Arthur Whitfield. Not while she was working at that diner. The next morning, Grace arrived early for her shift, tying her apron with a sense of purpose she had not felt in weeks. She glanced at the clock above the counter. Arthur usually arrived around 8:30, right after the morning rush began to slow down. She found herself watching the door, waiting. At 8:32, the bell above the door chimed, and Arthur Whitfield walked in, wearing the same gray coat, carrying the same folded newspaper under his arm. He paused for a moment near the entrance, as though bracing himself for whatever the day might bring, and then made his way toward his usual booth in the corner. Grace was already there before he sat down. "Good morning, Mr. Whitfield," she said warmly. "Your usual booth is all ready for you." Arthur looked at her, clearly surprised by the greeting, and something in his tired face seemed to soften. "Good morning," he replied. "You remembered." "Of course I remembered," Grace said, guiding him gently to his seat. "Coffee black, no sugar, right?" "That's right," Arthur said, settling into the booth. "You have a good memory." "I have a good reason to pay attention," Grace said, and she left to prepare his order, feeling Daniel Foss's eyes on her again from behind the counter, though she chose not to look back at him. Tyler Grant and his friends had not yet arrived that morning, and for a brief window of time, the diner felt peaceful. Arthur ate his breakfast slowly, occasionally glancing up to smile at Grace whenever she passed his booth. It was such a small thing, that smile, but it seemed to change something in the atmosphere of the room, as though a small light had been switched on in a place that had been dim for a very long time. But peace, as Grace would soon learn, rarely lasted long in that diner. Just as Arthur was finishing his coffee, the bell above the door chimed again, and Tyler Grant walked in with his friends, laughing loudly about something on one of their phones. Grace felt her stomach tighten immediately. Tyler's eyes scanned the room and landed on Arthur's booth. A slow, familiar smirk spread across his face, and Grace knew, with a sinking feeling, that yesterday's cruelty had not been a one-time event. It was only the beginning. She glanced at Arthur, who had also noticed Tyler's arrival. His shoulders tensed slightly, his hands tightening around his coffee cup, though he tried to appear calm, tried to focus on his newspaper as though nothing had changed. But Grace could see the fear in his eyes, the quiet dread of a man who had already learned the hard way that some mornings simply could not be trusted to stay peaceful. Grace took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and walked toward the counter to greet Tyler and his friends, determined that whatever happened next, Arthur Whitfield would not have to face it alone. Tyler Grant slid into a booth near the window with his two friends, Kevin and a thin, quiet young man named Owen, who rarely spoke but always laughed at whatever Tyler said. Grace approached the table with a notepad, keeping her expression as neutral and professional as she could manage. "What can I get you gentlemen this morning?" she asked. Tyler leaned back and studied her for a moment, as though sizing up an opponent rather than a waitress taking an order. "You're the one who yelled at me yesterday," he said, not quite a question. "I didn't yell," Grace replied calmly. "I asked you to stop bothering another customer. There's a difference." Kevin chuckled under his breath, but Tyler's expression hardened slightly, though he quickly masked it with a lazy smile. "Feisty," he said. "I like that. Bring me the usual, eggs, bacon, extra crispy." Grace wrote down the order without responding to his comment, and turned to take Kevin and Owen's orders as well. As she walked away, she heard Tyler mutter something to his friends, and though she could not make out the exact words, the tone was enough to make her stomach twist with unease. For the next 20 minutes, the diner settled into an uneasy rhythm. Arthur remained in his booth, quietly finishing his newspaper, while Tyler's table grew louder with conversation and laughter that seemed designed to draw attention. Grace moved between tables, refilling coffee cups and delivering plates, always keeping half an eye on both booths at once, like a nurse watching over two patients in the same room, each requiring a different kind of care. It was Owen, surprisingly, who spoke first when Grace returned to refill their coffee. "Hey," he said quietly, glancing toward Arthur's booth. "Isn't that the same old guy from yesterday?" "He has a name," Grace said. "Mr. Whitfield." Tyler smirked. "Mr. Whitfield," he repeated, drawing out the syllables mockingly. "Sounds like someone out of an old movie, probably still thinks it's 1960. "Leave him alone, Tyler," Grace said firmly, setting down the coffee pot on their table with more force than necessary. "I haven't even done anything yet," Tyler said, holding up his hands in mock innocence, though the smirk on his face told a different story entirely. Grace walked away, her jaw tight, wishing she could simply ban the man from the diner altogether. But she was only a waitress, and Daniel Foss had made it clear in his own quiet, evasive way that paying customers were paying customers, regardless of how they behaved. As the morning wore on, more regulars filtered into the diner. An elderly couple took a booth near the back. A young mother with two small children sat near the counter, trying to keep her toddler from throwing crackers on the floor. A construction worker in a reflective vest ordered a large breakfast to go. The diner filled with the comfortable noise of clinking plates and quiet conversation. And for a while, it seemed as though the tension from earlier might simply dissolve into the ordinary business of the day. Then Tyler stood up from his booth, stretching lazily, and made his way toward the counter, ostensibly to pay his bill, though his path took him directly past Arthur's table. Grace, standing near the register, watched with a growing sense of dread as Tyler paused beside Arthur's booth. "Enjoying your paper, old-timer?" Tyler asked, his voice carrying across the room. Arthur looked up slowly, his expression carefully neutral, though Grace could see the tension in the set of his jaw. "I am, thank you," Arthur replied politely. "Must be nice," Tyler continued, leaning against the edge of the booth. "Nothing to do all day but sit around drinking coffee. Some of us actually have jobs." "I worked for 43 years, Arthur said quietly, his voice steady despite the insult. I retired. That is what happens when a person grows old, young man. Perhaps you will understand that someday, if you are fortunate enough to live so long. For a moment, Tyler seemed genuinely caught off guard by the response, as though he had not expected the old man to speak back at all. A flicker of surprise crossed his face, quickly replaced by irritation. 43 years doing what? Tyler asked, his tone still mocking but now with a harder edge beneath it. Engineering, Arthur said simply, returning his attention to his newspaper as though the conversation had already ended. Tyler opened his mouth to respond, but Grace stepped forward before he could speak again. Your bill is ready at the counter, Tyler, she said, her voice firm and final, leaving no room for argument. Tyler glared at her for a long moment, then shrugged and walked away, muttering something under his breath that Grace chose not to acknowledge. She let out a slow breath, relieved that the confrontation had not escalated further, and glanced toward Arthur, who was staring down at his newspaper without actually reading it, his hands trembling slightly around the edges of the pages. She waited until Tyler and his friends had paid and left the diner before approaching Arthur's booth again. Are you all right, Mr. Whitfield? She asked, gently. Arthur looked up at her, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression, a vulnerability that he usually kept carefully hidden. I have been called worse things by better men, he said quietly. It is not the words that bother me, it is the reminder. The reminder of what? Grace asked, sliding into the seat across from him without thinking, forgetting for a moment that she was supposed to be working. Arthur was quiet for a long moment, his eyes drifting toward the window, watching the street outside. The reminder that I have become someone people look through rather than someone people look at, he said finally. When you are young, the whole world seems to notice you. Your opinions matter, your presence matters, and then slowly, without you even realizing it is happening, you become invisible. People speak about you as though you cannot hear them. They assume you have nothing left to offer. Grace felt her chest tight, with a mixture of sadness and anger. That's not true, she said. You have plenty to offer. Arthur smiled faintly, though the smile did not quite reach his eyes. You are kind to say so, but kindness like yours is rare, my dear. Most people simply do not have the patience to look closely enough to see what remains. Grace glanced toward the counter, noticing Daniel Foss watching her again, his expression tight with disapproval. She knew she needed to get back to work, but something in Arthur's words held her in place for a moment longer. Tell me about your work, she said. Engineering, what kind? Arthur's eyes brightened slightly, the way they might for a man remembering a piece of himself he had not thought about in a long time. Bridges, he said. I designed bridges for over 4 decades. There is a bridge not far from here, the one that crosses the river on the eastern side of town. I designed that one myself, back when I was younger than you are now. Grace's eyes widened with genuine surprise. The Eastern River Bridge, I drive across that every single day. Then you have been trusting my work with your life for quite some time, Arthur said, and this time his smile reached his eyes, a flicker of pride shining through the weariness. It has stood for 52 years without a single structural problem. I am rather proud of that. You should be, Grace said, genuinely impressed. That's incredible. It was a different life, Arthur said, his smile fading slightly. A life where people valued precision, patience, careful work. Nobody rushed. Nobody mocked an old man for taking his time. We understood that some things, the important things, cannot be hurried. Grace finally stood, aware that her break had stretched far longer than it should have. I have to get back to work, she said, but I would like to hear more if you don't mind sharing it. I would like that very much, Arthur said, and for the first time all morning, his voice carried something close to genuine warmth. It has been a long time since anyone asked. As Grace returned to the counter, Daniel Foss called her over with a sharp gesture. She approached him with a sinking feeling, already anticipating the conversation that was coming. You cannot keep sitting with customers during your shift, Daniel said quietly, though his tone carried an edge of real frustration. This is a business, Grace, not a social club. "He's lonely, Daniel," Grace said. "He comes in here every single day and nobody talks to him. Is it really so terrible that I spent a few minutes being kind to him?" "It's terrible when it affects your other tables," Daniel said. "And it's terrible when you're picking fights with customers who spend real money here. Tyler Grant and his friends come in almost every day. They tip generously. I cannot afford to lose that business because you have decided to become the old man's personal guardian." Grace felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "So it's fine for him to be humiliated, as long as his money is good." Daniel sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "I didn't say that. I'm saying you need to be careful, that's all. Do your job, be polite to everyone, but don't create problems that don't need to exist." Grace wanted to argue further, wanted to explain that the problem already existed long before she arrived, that Tyler had created it with his cruelty, and everyone else had simply chosen to look away. But she recognized the futility of arguing with a man who valued quiet peace over genuine justice. So she simply nodded and returned to her work, her mind still lingering on Arthur's story about the bridge, about the life he had lived, about the quiet dignity buried beneath the loneliness that had settled over him like a heavy coat he could not remove. For the remainder of her shift, Grace found herself watching Arthur with new eyes, seeing not just an old man sitting alone in a corner booth, but a person with an entire history, an entire lifetime of accomplishments and love and loss that most people would never bother to ask about. She realized with a growing sense of purpose that she wanted to know more, not out of pity, but out of genuine curiosity and respect. As the lunch rush began to build, filling the diner with new customers and fresh noise, Grace caught sight of Arthur slowly gathering his coat and newspaper, preparing to leave for the day, as he always did before the crowd grew too large and too loud for his comfort. She hurried over to help him with his coat, a small gesture that seemed to surprise him each time she offered it. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, smiling. "Same time tomorrow," Arthur confirmed, returning her smile. "Thank you, Grace, for everything." As he shuffled slowly toward the door, Grace noticed several other customers watching him leave, their expressions unreadable, though she thought she detected something new in the way they looked at him now. Perhaps it was only her imagination, but it seemed as though a few of them regarded him with slightly more attention than they had before, as though her small act of kindness the previous day had planted the faintest seed of awareness in the room. It was not much. It was not enough to undo years of quiet invisibility, but it was something, and Grace clung to that small hope as she watched the door close behind him, already dreading what tomorrow might bring, yet determined to face it, whatever it turned out to be. 3 days passed without incident, and Grace began to hope that Tyler Grant had simply lost interest in tormenting Arthur Whitfield, perhaps growing bored of a target who no longer reacted with visible distress. Each morning, Arthur arrived at 8:30 exactly, settled into his booth, and Grace made a point of greeting him warmly, bringing his coffee before he even had to ask. Slowly, day by day, he began to open up to her during the quiet moments between customers, sharing small pieces of his life like scattered puzzle pieces that Grace was gradually learning to fit together. She learned that his wife, Margaret, had been a school teacher for 30 years, beloved by generations of children who still sent her birthday cards long after they had grown and moved away. She learned that they had one daughter, Claire, who lived several states away with her own family, and that Arthur spoke to her on the phone every Sunday evening, though the calls had grown shorter over the years as Claire's life filled with the busy demands of raising teenagers of her own. She learned that Arthur had cared for Margaret alone during the final 2 years of her illness, refusing offers of professional help, because he wanted to be the one holding her hand through every difficult night. He had sold his car during that time to help cover medical expenses, which explained why he now walked everywhere, including the 15-minute walk to the diner each morning, regardless of the weather. "I don't mind the walking," Arthur told her one morning, as rain streaked down the windows outside. "It gives me time to think, and it reminds me that my legs still work, even if they don't work quite as quickly as they used to." Grace found herself looking forward to these small conversations more than she expected, treasuring them as quiet moments of genuine connection in what could otherwise be a long and exhausting workday. She began bringing a small notebook to keep in her apron pocket, jotting down details from their conversations so she would not forget them, a habit that felt important though she could not quite articulate why. On the fourth morning, everything changed. Grace arrived for her shift to find the diner unusually crowded for so early in the day, filled with the buzz of excited conversation. She soon discovered the reason. A local television crew was filming a segment about small businesses in the area, and Daniel Foss, thrilled at the prospect of free publicity, had invited them to film inside Miller's diner during the busy morning hours. The presence of cameras seemed to embolden Tyler Grant, who arrived shortly after 8 with Kevin and Owen, immediately drawn to the excitement of being filmed. He preened for the camera crew, striking up conversation with the reporter, clearly hoping to appear on the segment himself. Arthur arrived at his usual time, seemingly unaware of the commotion, and made his way toward his booth as he did every day. But today, his usual path was blocked by camera equipment and cables stretched across the floor, forcing him to navigate carefully around the obstacles, his movements slower and more cautious than usual as he tried not to trip. Tyler noticed immediately, and Grace watched with a sinking feeling as a familiar, cruel smile spread across his face. "Careful there, old-timer," Tyler called out loudly enough for the camera crew to hear. "Wouldn't want you to break a hip on national television." Several people laughed, though Grace noticed the reporter. A young woman with sharp eyes glanced toward Tyler with a flicker of disapproval that quickly vanished behind a professional smile. Arthur ignored the comment, continuing carefully toward his booth, but Tyler was not finished. He stood up from his seat, camera phone already raised, and approached Arthur's booth with exaggerated slowness, mimicking an elderly shuffle. "Look, everybody, I'm Mr. Whitfield," Tyler announced, drawing more laughter from Kevin and a few onlookers who did not fully understand the cruelty of what was happening, distracted by the novelty of the film crew and the general festive atmosphere of the morning. Grace felt something inside her snap. She set down the coffee pot she had been holding and walked directly toward Tyler, her heart pounding but her resolve absolute. "Stop it," she said, loud enough for the entire diner to hear, loud enough that even the camera crew turned their attention toward her instead of Tyler. Tyler lowered his phone, clearly annoyed at being interrupted mid-performance. "Relax," he said. "It's just a joke." "It's not a joke," Grace said, her voice shaking slightly with anger but growing steadier with each word. "It's cruelty. This man comes in here every single day, minds his own business, and you've decided to torment him because it makes you feel powerful. It doesn't. It makes you look small." The diner had gone completely silent now, every eye fixed on the confrontation unfolding near Arthur's booth. Arthur himself sat frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the table, clearly mortified by the sudden attention. Tyler's face flushed with anger, his earlier amusement curdling into something harder and meaner. "Watch yourself," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You're just a waitress. I could get you fired with one phone call to your manager." "Go ahead," Grace said, surprising herself with her own steadiness. "Call him. I'm sure he would love to explain to this news crew why his restaurant employs someone who bullies elderly customers." The reporter, sensing an unexpected and far more interesting story than the one she had originally planned to film, quietly signaled her cameraman to keep recording, though she remained silent, watching the scene unfold with sharp professional interest. Tyler glanced around, suddenly aware that the entire diner, along with a professional camera crew, was watching him with expressions ranging from discomfort to outright disapproval. The confident smirk he usually wore like armor faltered, just slightly, as the reality of the situation began to sink in. "This is ridiculous," Tyler muttered, though his voice had lost some of its earlier bravado. He turned and walked back toward his booth, grabbing his jacket and gesturing for Kevin and Owen to follow him. "Let's go. This place is trash anyway." As Tyler stormed toward the exit, he paused briefly beside Arthur's booth one final time. For a moment, Grace feared he might say something even crueler as a parting shot, but instead, he simply glared at Arthur with cold contempt before pushing through the door and disappearing onto the street, his friends trailing behind him in awkward silence. The diner remained quiet for a long moment after the door swung shut, everyone processing what had just happened. Then, slowly, a few scattered customers began to applaud, and Grace felt her cheeks flush with a mixture of embarrassment and relief. Daniel Foss appeared at her side, his expression tight and unreadable. "My office," he said quietly. "Now." Grace's stomach dropped, but she nodded and followed him toward the small back office, aware of curious eyes following her the entire way. Before she reached the office door, however, she felt a gentle hand on her arm and turned to find the television reporter standing beside her. "That was incredibly brave," the reporter said, extending her hand. "I'm Nora Fielding with Channel 9 News. Would you be willing to speak with me for a few minutes once you're finished here?" Grace glanced nervously toward Daniel's office, then back at the reporter. "I might not have a job in a few minutes," she admitted quietly. Nora's expression softened with sympathy. "Well, if that happens, I would still love to hear your perspective on what just occurred. What you did took real courage." Grace thanked her and continued toward the office, bracing herself for whatever consequences awaited her. Daniel closed the door behind them and sat heavily in his chair, rubbing his forehead with visible frustration. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" he asked. "That entire scene was captured on camera by a news crew. It's going to be everywhere." "I know," Grace said, standing her ground despite her nervousness. "And I'm not sorry for it, Daniel. What Tyler was doing was wrong. Someone needed to say something." "That someone didn't have to be you. During working hours, in front of a camera crew I invited here to promote this business," Daniel snapped. "This could be a disaster for us." "Or it could be exactly the opposite," Grace countered. "People are tired of seeing cruelty go unchallenged. Maybe this shows that Miller's Diner is a place that actually cares about its customers, all of its customers, not just the ones who tip generously." Daniel stared at her for a long moment, clearly weighing her words against his own instinctive fear of controversy and disruption. Finally, he sighed heavily. "I'm not firing you," he said, "but I need you to understand the position this puts me in. Tyler and his friends have been regular customers for over a year." "And how many other customers have they driven away with their behavior?" Grace asked. "How many people have felt uncomfortable in here because of them, but never said anything because they didn't want to cause a scene?" Daniel didn't have an immediate answer for that, and Grace took his silence as an opportunity to press further. "Mr. Whitfield comes in here every single day, Daniel. He's been a loyal customer for years, hasn't he? Doesn't his comfort matter just as much as Tyler's business?" Daniel finally nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "You're right," he admitted, though he seemed almost surprised to hear himself say it. "Go on, get back to work. And Grace, for what it's worth, that was a decent thing you did out there." Relief flooded through Grace as she left the office, though her legs still felt slightly unsteady from the adrenaline of the confrontation. When she returned to the main floor of the diner, she found Arthur still seated in his booth, looking pale and shaken, though he offered her a small, grateful smile as she approached. "You didn't need to do that," Arthur said quietly. "You could have lost your position." "Some things are more important than a job," Grace replied, sliding into the seat across from him, no longer caring whether Daniel noticed or disapproved. "Are you all right?" Arthur nodded slowly, though his hands still trembled slightly as he wrapped them around his coffee cup. "I have endured worse insults in my life," he said, "but it has been a very long time since anyone stood up for me the way you just did. I had almost forgotten what that felt like." Nora Fielding approached the booth cautiously, her cameraman a respectful distance behind her. "Excuse me, Mr. Whitfield," she said gently. "My name is Nora Fielding. I was wondering if you might be willing to share a bit of your story with our viewers. I think what happened here today matters, and I think people should hear about it." Arthur glanced uncertainly at Grace, who gave him an encouraging nod. "I suppose," he said slowly, "there might be some value in speaking up for once rather than remaining silent." And so, for the first time in longer than he could remember, Arthur Whitfield found himself sharing his story, not with a stranger passing by, but with an entire community that was about to learn exactly who he was, and exactly what had been happening to him, one small cruelty at a time, in the quiet corner booth of a diner that most people walked past without a second thought. The interview aired that evening on the local news, and by the following morning, it had spread far beyond what anyone at Miller's Diner could have anticipated. Nora Fielding's segment, originally intended as a simple feature on small local businesses, had transformed into something far more powerful, a short but moving piece about kindness, dignity, and the quiet cruelty that so often goes unnoticed in ordinary places. The footage showed Grace standing up to Tyler, her voice firm and unwavering, followed by a brief but emotional interview with Arthur, in which he spoke softly about his late wife, about his years designing bridges, about the loneliness that had crept into his life since retirement and Margaret's passing. He spoke, too, about how easy it had become for people to look past him, to treat him as though his age had erased his worth as a human being. By the time Grace arrived for her shift the next morning, the diner's parking lot was fuller than she had ever seen it. Word had spread quickly through the small town, and it seemed as though half the community had decided to visit Miller's Diner that morning, partly out of curiosity, partly out of genuine support for what they had seen on the news the night before. Grace pushed through the door and immediately noticed the shift in atmosphere. Customers who had never spoken to her before greeted her warmly as she passed, several offering words of encouragement or simple thanks for what she had done. An elderly woman stopped her near the counter, gripping her hand tightly. "My husband passed years ago," the woman said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know exactly what that man feels like, being invisible to the world. Thank you for reminding people that we still matter." Grace felt a lump rise in her throat as she thanked the woman and continued toward the counter, overwhelmed by the sudden outpouring of support. Daniel Foss stood near the register, looking dazed but pleased as he surveyed the packed dining room. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly as Grace approached. "I was worried about losing business. Instead, it seems we've gained quite a bit of it." "I'm glad," Grace said. "But this was never about business for me, Daniel. It was about Mr. Whitfield." "I understand that now," Daniel said, nodding sincerely. "And for what it's worth, from now on, this diner has a policy. Nobody, regardless of how much they spend here, gets to treat another customer with disrespect. Not on my watch." Arthur arrived at his usual time, though today he seemed almost overwhelmed by the crowd waiting to see him. Several customers stood as he entered, offering quiet applause, and Grace watched as a look of stunned disbelief crossed his weathered face. He had spent so many years believing himself forgotten that the sudden attention seemed almost too much for him to process. Grace hurried to his side, gently guiding him toward his booth, now decorated with a small handwritten sign that read "Reserved for Mr. Whitfield," a gesture Daniel had insisted upon that morning as a small but meaningful apology for years of quiet neglect. "I don't know what to say," Arthur murmured, sinking into his seat, visibly shaken by the emotional weight of the moment. "I never expected any of this." "You deserve it," Grace said simply, setting his coffee in front of him. "All of it." As the morning progressed, Grace noticed something remarkable happening throughout the diner. Customers who had previously ignored Arthur, treating him as little more than background scenery in their daily routines, now approached his booth to introduce themselves, to shake his hand, to ask him questions about his life and his work. A young engineering student, recognizing Arthur's name from the segment, spent nearly 20 minutes discussing bridge design with him, clearly fascinated by his decades of hands-on experience. Arthur seemed to grow more animated with each conversation, his posture straightening, his voice growing steadier and more confident as he realized, perhaps for the first time in years, that people genuinely wanted to hear what he had to say. Grace watched from a distance, her heart swelling with quiet satisfaction, though she remained aware that not everyone in town shared the same enthusiasm for what had unfolded. Later that afternoon, as the crowd finally began to thin, Grace received a text message from an unknown number. She opened it cautiously and felt her stomach twist with unease as she read the words displayed on her screen. "You think you're a hero now. You have no idea what you started." Grace stared at the message for a long moment, uncertain whether to feel frightened or simply annoyed. She had no way of knowing for certain who had sent it, though she strongly suspected Tyler Grant or one of his friends. She debated showing it to Daniel, but ultimately decided against it, not wanting to give the sender the satisfaction of knowing his message had rattled her. She tucked her phone away and returned to work, determined not to let a cowardly anonymous threat overshadow what had otherwise been an extraordinary day. But as she continued her shift, she found herself glancing toward the windows more frequently than usual, a small seed of unease planted firmly in the back of her mind. That evening, as Grace prepared to leave the diner, Arthur approached her near the door, his expression thoughtful and slightly hesitant. "May I walk with you part way?" he asked. "I would like to speak with you if you have a moment." Grace agreed, and the two of them stepped out into the cool evening air together, walking slowly along the quiet sidewalk as the sun began to set behind the buildings lining the street. "I have been thinking," Arthur said after a few minutes of comfortable silence, "about everything that has happened these past few days. I want you to understand something, Grace. What you did for me was not simply an act of kindness toward a stranger. It was something far more significant. You reminded an entire community that we do not simply stop mattering because we grow old, or because we grow quiet, or because the world has decided we are no longer useful." Grace listened carefully, moved by the sincerity in his voice. "When Margaret was alive," Arthur continued, "I never worried about being forgotten because she saw me every single day. She reminded me simply by existing beside me that I mattered. When she passed, I lost more than a wife. I lost the one person who made me feel visible in this world, and slowly, without realizing it was happening, I began to disappear piece by piece, until I became nothing more than an old man in a corner booth that people preferred not to look at too closely." "You're not invisible," Grace said firmly. "Not to me, and clearly not to a great many other people, based on what happened today." Arthur smiled, a genuine, warm smile that reached all the way to his tired eyes. "No," he agreed, "not anymore, and that is entirely because of you." They continued walking together in comfortable silence for a while longer, until they reached the corner where their paths would separate, Arthur heading toward his quiet house on Maple Street, Grace continuing toward her small apartment several blocks further. "Thank you," Arthur said simply, before turning to make his way home. Grace watched him walk away, his steps slower than most, but somehow steadier than they had been just days before, as though the weight of invisibility had finally begun to lift from his shoulders. She smiled to herself and continued her own walk home, unaware that the anonymous threat she had received earlier that day was only the first small warning of trouble that was still to come. A week passed, and the initial excitement surrounding the news segment gradually settled into something quieter and more sustainable. The diner remained busier than before, but the crowds no longer felt like a spectacle, instead becoming a steady rhythm of regulars who had discovered, or rediscovered, a place that treated its customers with genuine warmth. Arthur continued arriving each morning at 8:30, and Grace continued greeting him with the same steady kindness that had started everything, though now several other regulars made a point of stopping by his booth to chat for a few minutes before continuing their own days. One such regular was Peter Langley, a retired history teacher who had lived in town his entire life. He began joining Arthur most mornings, the two men discovering a shared love of old engineering projects and local history, their conversations often stretching well past their usual coffee refills. Grace found herself smiling every time she overheard their animated discussions about bridges, buildings, and the way the town had changed over the decades. "You've given him a friend," Grace's coworker Lily mentioned one afternoon, nodding toward Arthur and Peter's booth. I don't think I've ever seen him laugh before, not until this week. Grace agreed, feeling a quiet sense of pride at the transformation she had witnessed. But not everyone in town shared the same warmth toward the recent events. Tyler Grant had not returned to Miller's diner since the confrontation, though Grace occasionally heard second-hand reports of his growing resentment, fueled by the widespread attention the news segment had received, and the criticism he had faced online once footage of his behavior circulated beyond the original broadcast. Some of that criticism had apparently followed him into his personal life as well. Grace heard from a mutual acquaintance that Tyler had lost a part-time coaching position at a local youth sports program after several parents raised concerns about his conduct following the viral clip. Whether the rumor was entirely accurate, Grace could not say for certain, but she suspected there was at least some truth to it, given how thoroughly the video had spread across the community. She thought little more of it until one quiet Tuesday afternoon, when Tyler himself walked back through the diner's front door for the first time since the incident. The diner grew noticeably quieter as customers recognized him, several exchanging uneasy glances. Grace felt her guard rise immediately, though she forced herself to remain calm and professional as she approached him near the entrance. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. Tyler's expression was harder to read than usual, lacking the arrogant confidence he had always carried before. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said quietly. "I just wanted to talk to him, to Mr. Whitfield." Grace glanced toward Arthur's booth, where the old man had gone very still, watching the exchange with visible wariness. "I don't think that's a good idea," Grace said. "Please," Tyler said, and something in his voice, a rare note of genuine humility, gave Grace pause. "Just 5 minutes, I promise." Grace hesitated, torn between her instinct to protect Arthur and a small flicker of curiosity about what Tyler might actually intend to say. Finally, she turned toward Arthur's booth. "It's up to you, Mr. Whitfield," she said. "You don't have to speak with him if you don't want to." Arthur studied Tyler for a long moment, his expression unreadable before finally nodding slowly. "Let him sit," he said quietly. "I would like to hear what he has to say." Grace remained close by, though she gave the two men enough space to speak privately, watching carefully from a short distance as Tyler slowly approached the booth and lowered himself into the seat across from Arthur, looking distinctly uncomfortable, a stark contrast to the confident swagger he had always displayed before. "I've lost my job," Tyler said quietly, staring down at the table rather than meeting Arthur's eyes. "The coaching position I had. They let me go because of the video." Arthur remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I'm not telling you that so you'll feel sorry for me," Tyler continued, his voice tight with something that sounded almost like shame. "I'm telling you because it made me actually think about what I did, really think about it for the first time. I've been laughing at people my whole life, making jokes at their expense. I never really considered how it might feel on the other side." Arthur studied him carefully, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "And how does it feel," he asked quietly, "now that you understand?" Tyler swallowed hard. "Terrible," he admitted. "I keep seeing that video, seeing myself, seeing how cruel I looked. My mother saw it too. She called me, crying, asking why I would treat anyone that way, let alone an elderly man who had done nothing to deserve it." "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Arthur said. "She raised me better than this," Tyler said. "I don't really know why I acted the way I did. I think maybe it made me feel powerful, watching people laugh at my jokes. I never really thought about the person I was hurting to get those laughs." Arthur was quiet for a long moment, considering his words carefully before speaking. "When I was your age," he said finally, "I worked alongside men who treated me poorly because I was different from them, quieter, more focused on precision than on being liked. I understand, perhaps better than you realize, what it feels like to seek validation through unkind means, though I never resorted to cruelty myself. But I understand the hunger for attention that can drive young men toward poor choices." Tyler looked up at him, clearly surprised by the unexpected understanding in Arthur's response. "What you did was wrong," Arthur continued firmly. I will not pretend otherwise, nor will I claim that the pain you caused me has simply disappeared because you have decided, rather conveniently, to feel remorse only after facing consequences yourself. But I also believe that people are capable of change, if they are genuinely willing to pursue it. I am willing, Tyler said quickly. I want to make things right somehow. I just don't know how. Arthur considered this for a long moment. Time, he said finally. Time and consistent kindness demonstrated not just to me but to everyone you encounter. Words alone mean very little, young man. It is our actions, repeated day after day, that reveal our true character. Tyler nodded slowly, seeming to absorb the weight of Arthur's words. Can I start somewhere? He asked. Is there anything I can actually do? Arthur studied him for a long moment before responding. There is an organization in town, he said. A community center that assists elderly residents who live alone, helping with small tasks they can no longer manage themselves. Grocery shopping, minor home repairs, simple companionship. Perhaps you might consider volunteering there. Tyler seemed surprised by the suggestion, though he nodded slowly. I could do that, he said. I will do that. Grace, who had been listening from a respectful distance, felt a cautious flicker of hope at the exchange, though she remained wary of trusting Tyler's sincerity too quickly, given his history of cruelty. Still, she recognized something genuine in his posture, in the way he seemed almost smaller now, stripped of the arrogant bravado that had always defined him before. Tyler stood slowly, extending his hand toward Arthur, who studied it for a moment before finally accepting the gesture with a firm, deliberate handshake. Thank you for talking with me, Tyler said quietly. I know I don't deserve your kindness. Perhaps not, Arthur agreed simply. But kindness given only to those who deserve it is not truly kindness at all. It is merely a transaction. I would rather offer you the opportunity to become someone better than I would enjoy the satisfaction of holding a grudge. Tyler left the diner a few minutes later, considerably more subdued than he had ever appeared before, and Grace approached Arthur's booth once the door had closed behind him. Do you really believe he'll change? She asked. Arthur considered the question carefully before answering. I do not know, he admitted, but I believe in offering people the chance to prove themselves, one way or the other. Whether he takes that chance is entirely up to him. Grace nodded, though privately she wondered whether Tyler's newfound humility would truly last, or whether it was simply a temporary reaction to public embarrassment that would fade once the attention surrounding the incident eventually died down. She hoped, for Arthur's sake, and for the sake of everyone Tyler might encounter in the future, that his remorse was genuine. But as the days passed and Tyler did not return to Miller's diner, Grace found herself uncertain whether his apology had marked a true turning point, or merely a brief pause before old habits inevitably resurfaced. She would not have to wait long to discover the answer, though the circumstances that revealed it would prove far more dramatic than anyone at the diner could have anticipated. 2 weeks after his conversation with Arthur, Tyler Grant kept his word. He began volunteering at the Riverside Community Center, a modest building on the edge of town that coordinated services for elderly residents living alone. Grace learned about this development from Peter Langley, who happened to know one of the coordinators at the center, and had heard about a new volunteer showing up faithfully every Saturday morning, quiet and diligent, asking for the most difficult and least glamorous tasks available. He's been helping an elderly woman named Dorothy fix her fence, Peter told Grace and Arthur one morning over coffee. Apparently he spent 3 weekends in a row working on it, refusing any payment, even when she insisted. Arthur listened with quiet interest, though he offered no comment beyond a small, thoughtful nod. Grace, however, found herself genuinely surprised and cautiously optimistic that Tyler's remorse had indeed been sincere. Life at the diner had settled into a comfortable new rhythm since the initial excitement of the news segment had faded. Arthur remained a beloved fixture of the community, his corner booth now a regular gathering spot for several regulars who enjoyed his stories and his quiet wisdom. Grace had grown close to him over the passing weeks, visiting his house occasionally on her days off to help with small tasks around his home, and gradually learning even more about the remarkable life he had lived before loneliness had settled over him like an uninvited guest. But not everything remained peaceful. One evening, as Grace prepared to close up the diner after a long shift, she noticed a figure lingering near the parking lot outside, half hidden in the shadows beyond the streetlights. Her heart quickened uncomfortably as she recognized the silhouette. "Kevin," she said cautiously, stepping outside despite her unease. "What are you doing here?" Kevin stepped forward slightly, his expression tense and agitated. "Tyler's been different since all this happened," he said without preamble. "He barely talks to us anymore, spends all his weekends at that community center instead of hanging out with his friends. It's like he's trying to become a completely different person." "Maybe that's not a bad thing," Grace said carefully, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "He used to be fun," Kevin said, a note of genuine bitterness creeping into his voice. "Now he's just, I don't even know, guilty, I guess, all the time, and it's your fault, yours and that old man's." Grace felt a flicker of alarm at the hostility in his tone, though she forced herself to remain calm. "Kevin, if Tyler wants to become a better person, that should be something to support, not resent." "You don't understand," Kevin said, his voice rising slightly. "Owen and I have been getting harassed online because of that stupid video. People recognized us in the background. We didn't even do anything, and we're getting blamed just as much as Tyler." "Maybe," Grace said gently, "this could be an opportunity for you as well, to reflect on things the way Tyler has." Kevin's expression darkened further. "I don't need a lecture from a waitress," he snapped. "I just wanted you to know that some of us aren't happy about how this turned out. Not everyone thinks you're some kind of hero." He turned abruptly and walked away into the darkness before Grace could respond, leaving her standing alone in the empty parking lot, her heart pounding with a mixture of anger and unease. She quickly finished locking up the diner and hurried home, the encounter weighing heavily on her mind throughout the following days. She debated telling Arthur about the confrontation, uncertain whether it would only cause him unnecessary worry, but ultimately decided that honesty was more important than shielding him from uncomfortable truths. "I appreciate you telling me," Arthur said thoughtfully, after she recounted the conversation with Kevin the following morning. "Though I confess, I am not entirely surprised. Change rarely comes easily, or completely, for everyone involved. Tyler has chosen a difficult path, and it seems his choice has created friction among his former companions." "Do you think we're in any danger?" Grace asked, unable to fully shake the unease Kevin's words had planted within her. Arthur considered the question seriously before responding. "I do not believe Kevin intends any real harm," he said slowly. "His words sound more like frustration and jealousy than genuine malice, but it would be wise to remain cautious nonetheless. Anger, even when it stems from insecurity rather than true cruelty, can sometimes lead people toward regrettable actions." Grace nodded, appreciating his measured perspective, though the unease lingered at the edges of her thoughts for the remainder of the day. A few days later, the situation escalated in a way none of them had anticipated. Grace arrived at work one morning to find Daniel Foss waiting for her near the entrance, his expression grim. "Someone broke the front window last night," he said, gesturing toward a sheet of plywood temporarily covering a jagged hole in the glass near the entrance. "Security footage caught someone throwing a rock through it around 2 in the morning. I've already called the police." Grace felt her stomach drop as she stared at the damage. "Do they know who did it?" "The footage is too dark and grainy to identify anyone clearly," Daniel said, "but there was something left behind." He handed her a folded piece of paper, his expression tight with concern. Grace unfolded the paper carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she read the crude, hastily scrawled message. "Stop protecting him. This isn't over." "I think you should show this to the police," Grace said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I already have," Daniel confirmed. They're taking it seriously, given everything that's happened recently. They want to speak with you, actually, since the message seems directed specifically at you. Grace spent the following hour speaking with 2 local police officers, explaining the entire situation from the initial confrontation with Tyler to the anonymous text message she had received weeks earlier, which she had unfortunately deleted without saving as evidence, a decision she now deeply regretted. "We'll increase patrols in this area," one of the officers assured her, "and we'll look into anyone with a history of conflict related to this situation. In the meantime, please be careful and report anything unusual immediately." Word of the vandalism spread quickly through the small community, reigniting the attention that had begun to fade following the initial news segment. Nora Fielding returned to the diner that same afternoon, eager to cover this troubling new development in what had become, for her, an ongoing story of unusual local significance. Arthur arrived at his usual time, visibly disturbed by the news of the broken window, his concern evident despite his attempts to remain composed. "This is precisely what I feared," he said quietly to Grace, once they found a private moment together. "I never intended for you to become a target because of your kindness toward me." "This isn't your fault," Grace said firmly. "Whoever did this made their own choice. You didn't cause this, Arthur. Cruelty and cowardice caused this." Despite her reassurances, Grace could see the guilt weighing heavily on Arthur's shoulders throughout the remainder of the day, and she found herself worrying not just about her own safety, but about the toll this ongoing situation might be taking on his fragile peace of mind, so recently and carefully rebuilt after years of quiet isolation. That evening, as Grace prepared to leave the diner, she was surprised to find Tyler Grant waiting near the parking lot, looking anxious and uncomfortable. "I heard about the window," he said immediately before Grace could ask why he had come. "I swear it wasn't me. I would never do something like that." "I believe you," Grace said, somewhat to her own surprise, recognizing genuine distress in his expression. "I think it might have been Kevin," Tyler continued, his voice tight with worry. "He's been furious ever since I started volunteering. Says I'm making him look bad by comparison, that people online keep mentioning his name alongside mine, blaming him for things he claims he never even said or did." Grace felt a chill settle over her at this confirmation of her earlier suspicions. "Have you spoken to him about it?" "I tried," Tyler said. "He wouldn't listen. Said I'd betrayed our friendship by taking your side and Mr. Whitfield's side. I'm worried he might actually do something serious if this keeps escalating." "You should tell the police what you just told me," Grace said. Tyler hesitated, clearly torn by the prospect of implicating a longtime friend, but finally nodded slowly. "I will," he said. "I don't want anyone getting hurt because of this, especially not Mr. Whitfield. He's been more patient with me than I ever deserved." Grace watched him walk away into the evening, uncertain whether his concerns about Kevin were accurate, but grateful, nonetheless, for his willingness to come forward, despite the discomfort it clearly caused him. She hurried home that night with a renewed sense of caution, glancing repeatedly over her shoulder, aware that whatever conflict had been set into motion by that first cruel morning in the diner was far from finished unfolding. The police investigation moved quickly, once Tyler provided his statement about Kevin's growing resentment and erratic behavior in the weeks following the viral video. Officers visited Kevin's home the following afternoon, and though he denied any involvement in the vandalism, his defensive and inconsistent answers apparently raised enough suspicion that they began looking more closely into his recent activities. Grace learned most of this secondhand, through Peter Langley's connections around town, though she remained cautious about placing too much confidence in unconfirmed rumors. What she did know for certain was that the atmosphere at Miller's Diner had grown noticeably tense in the days following the broken window, with Daniel Foss installing new security cameras and insisting that Grace never remain alone in the building after closing hours. Arthur, too, seemed more subdued than usual, his earlier joy at rediscovering social connection now tempered by worry over the trouble his situation had inadvertently caused. Grace noticed him watching the diner's entrance more carefully than before, his relaxed posture replaced by a quiet vigilance that reminded her uncomfortably of how he had once carried himself before her small acts of kindness had begun restoring his confidence. "I don't want you to feel afraid," Grace told him one morning, noticing the tension in his shoulders as the door chimed with each new customer's arrival. "None of this is your fault." "I know that logically," Arthur said quietly, "but logic and feeling are not always the same thing, my dear. I have lived a long life, and I have learned that guilt rarely listens to reason." Grace squeezed his hand gently, wishing she could offer more comfort than words alone could provide. She understood, perhaps more than she let on, the particular weight of carrying responsibility for consequences that were never truly one's own fault to bear. Nearly a week after the vandalism incident, the situation reached its resolution in a manner nobody had fully anticipated. Grace was closing the diner alone one evening, Daniel having left slightly early to handle a family matter, when she noticed a figure approaching the entrance just as she prepared to lock the door. Her heart leaped with alarm as she recognized Kevin standing outside, his expression unreadable in the dim evening light. She hesitated, considering whether to simply lock the door and call for help, but something in his posture, hunched and clearly distressed rather than aggressive, gave her pause. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Kevin said quickly, seeming to sense her fear. "I just needed to talk to someone. I don't know who else to turn to." Grace remained cautious, keeping the door only partially open. "Kevin, if you're responsible for that broken window, you need to speak with the police, not with me." Kevin's face crumpled slightly, and to Grace's surprise, his eyes filled with unshed tears. "It was me," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I threw the rock, I wrote that note, I don't even really know why I did it. I was just so angry, watching everyone treat Tyler like some kind of reformed hero, while I got dragged through the mud for things I barely even said." Grace felt a complicated mixture of relief and sympathy at his confession, uncertain how to respond to such raw and unexpected vulnerability. "You need to tell the police," she said gently. "Doing the right thing now matters, Kevin, regardless of what happened before." "I know," Kevin said, wiping at his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "I've been carrying this around for days. I can't sleep. I keep thinking about that old man, about how scared everyone must have been because of what I did. I never actually wanted to hurt anyone. I was just lost, I guess. Watching my friend change into someone I didn't recognize, someone better than me, and not knowing how to handle that." Grace opened the door fully now, gesturing for him to step inside where they could speak more comfortably. "Change is hard to watch sometimes," she said, "especially when it makes us look at our own choices more closely than we'd like." Kevin nodded, sinking into a nearby chair, looking utterly exhausted by the weight of his confession. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. "Now you make it right," Grace said simply. "You call the police yourself before they come to you. You take responsibility, and maybe eventually you find your own way to become someone better, the same way Tyler has been trying to." Kevin remained silent for a long moment, staring at his hands. "Do you think Mr. Whitfield could ever forgive me?" he asked finally. "I don't know," Grace admitted honestly. "But I know he believes people are capable of change if they're truly willing to pursue it. He gave Tyler that chance. Perhaps he would extend the same chance to you if you're genuinely willing to earn it." Kevin left the diner shortly afterward, promising to contact the police that same evening, and Grace immediately called Daniel to inform him of the unexpected confession, relief flooding through her at the prospect of finally resolving the unsettling uncertainty that had hung over the past several weeks. True to his word, Kevin turned himself in that night, providing a full confession to the police regarding the vandalism and the threatening note. Because Miller's diner had suffered only property damage, and because Kevin agreed to pay for the repairs and complete a period of community service, the matter was resolved without more serious legal consequences, though the experience clearly left a lasting impression on him. Arthur received the news the following morning with quiet, thoughtful consideration rather than anger. "I am relieved this matter has finally reached its conclusion," he said, sipping his coffee slowly. "Though I confess, I feel a measure of sympathy for that young man as well. Anger born from insecurity is a heavy burden to carry, particularly when a person does not yet possess the wisdom to understand its true source." "You're remarkably forgiving," Grace observed, not for the first time since she had come to know him. "I have found," Arthur replied, "that forgiveness costs the giver far less than the burden of resentment does. I learned this lesson slowly, over many years, watching Margaret extend grace to people who did not always deserve it, simply because she believed everyone carried the potential for goodness within them, if only given the opportunity to discover it." Grace smiled, moved once again by the quiet wisdom Arthur so consistently offered, wisdom earned through decades of experience that most people around him had simply failed to notice or appreciate, until circumstances finally forced them to look more closely. In the weeks that followed, both Tyler and Kevin became regular volunteers at the Riverside Community Center, working alongside each other to rebuild not only their reputations within the community, but also their friendship, now grounded in something far more meaningful than the careless cruelty that had once defined their bond. Grace occasionally saw them together around town, helping elderly residents with yard work or grocery deliveries, their transformation slow but genuine, exactly the kind of change Arthur had always believed was possible, given sufficient time and sincere effort. Miller's Diner, meanwhile, settled into a new and improved version of itself, its reputation within the community strengthened rather than damaged by the difficult events of recent weeks. Daniel Foss implemented a formal policy explicitly prohibiting disrespectful treatment of any customer, regardless of their spending habits, a policy he now enforced without hesitation whenever necessary. Grace continued working there happily, her friendship with Arthur growing deeper with each passing week, the two of them having formed a bond that neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed over a spilled cup of coffee and a moment of unexpected courage. As autumn settled over the small town, bringing cooler mornings and earlier sunsets, Arthur Whitfield found himself, for the first time in 3 long years, genuinely looking forward to each new day, no longer merely enduring his loneliness, but actively building a life filled with meaningful connection, renewed purpose, and the quiet, steady dignity that had always belonged to him, waiting patiently to be recognized by someone brave enough to truly see him. 6 months passed, and the changes that had begun with a single moment of courage in a small-town diner had rippled outward in ways nobody could have predicted that first difficult morning. Arthur Whitfield's corner booth remained a fixture of Miller's Diner, though it had transformed from a place of quiet isolation into a gathering point for genuine friendship and community, a small but meaningful reminder of what could happen when people chose to see one another clearly, rather than looking away from discomfort or inconvenience. Grace had been promoted to assistant manager, a position Daniel Foss offered her in recognition of the leadership and integrity she had demonstrated throughout the entire ordeal. She approached her new responsibilities with the same quiet determination she had shown from the very beginning, ensuring that every customer who walked through the diner's doors, regardless of their age, appearance, or circumstances, received the respect and kindness they deserved. Arthur's friendship with Peter Langley had deepened into something the two men had not expected to find so late in their lives, a genuine companionship built on shared history, mutual respect, and countless hours of animated conversation about engineering, local history, and the world as it had once been. They had begun meeting twice weekly for chess matches at the community center, their games often drawing a small audience of curious onlookers who enjoyed watching the friendly rivalry between two sharp minds that refused to be dulled by age. Tyler Grant had continued his volunteer work at the Riverside Community Center, eventually taking on a more formal role coordinating activities for elderly residents throughout the county. The transformation in his character had proven genuine and lasting, earning him a quiet respect within the community that stood in stark contrast to the reputation he had once carried. He visited Arthur occasionally, the two of them having developed an unlikely but sincere friendship built upon the foundation of accountability and forgiveness that had first brought them together under such difficult circumstances. Kevin, too, had found his own path toward growth, eventually enrolling in a counseling program that helped him better understand the insecurities that had driven his earlier behavior. He remained humble about his progress, understanding that genuine change required continuous effort rather than a single moment of realization, and he often credited Arthur's willingness to extend patience and understanding as the turning point that had allowed him to begin truly examining his own choices. One crisp autumn morning, nearly a year after that first difficult encounter, Grace arrived at the diner to find Arthur already seated in his booth, an unusually bright smile lighting up his weathered face. "You look happy this morning," Grace observed, setting his coffee down in front of him. "I received a letter from my daughter," Arthur said, unable to contain his excitement. "Claire and her family are moving back to the area next spring. She said she wants her children to know their grandfather properly, not merely through brief telephone calls on Sunday evenings." Grace felt tears prick at her eyes, genuinely moved by the news. "Arthur, that's wonderful." "She said something in the letter that struck me deeply," Arthur continued, his voice thick with emotion. "She had seen the news segment, months ago, and it made her realize how much time had passed since she had truly checked in on me, beyond simple phone calls. She said watching a stranger defend me on television made her ashamed that her own father's daughter had not been paying closer attention." "You don't need to feel any shame," Grace said gently. "Life gets complicated, people get busy. What matters is that she's coming back now." "Yes," Arthur agreed, his eyes glistening with unshed tears of joy. "That is precisely what matters." As the morning progressed, several familiar faces filtered through the diner, greeting Arthur warmly as they passed his booth, a routine that had become so natural over the past year that Grace sometimes forgot how remarkably different things had once been, back when this same man had sat alone in this same corner, invisible to nearly everyone around him. Nora Fielding stopped by later that morning, having become something of a regular herself since her initial coverage of the story, always eager to check in on Arthur's continued well-being and occasionally interviewing him for follow-up segments that had become surprisingly popular among local viewers. "I've been thinking about doing a longer piece," Nora mentioned, settling into the booth beside Arthur. "Something about the ripple effects of small kindness. How one moment of courage from a young waitress managed to change so many lives, not just yours, Arthur, but Tyler's and Kevin's as well." "I would be honored to participate," Arthur said, "though I believe the true credit belongs entirely to Grace. Without her willingness to speak up that first difficult morning, none of this would have ever happened." Grace, overhearing the conversation from nearby, felt her cheeks flush with humble embarrassment. "I only did what anyone should have done," she said. "It shouldn't take courage to simply treat people with basic decency." "And yet," Arthur said quietly, "it so often does. That is precisely why what you did mattered so profoundly. You reminded an entire community of something we should never need reminding of, yet somehow, so often, we do." As the afternoon light began to soften outside the diner's windows, Grace found herself reflecting on everything that had transpired over the past year, beginning with nothing more than a shattered coffee cup and a moment of unexpected cruelty. She thought about how easily she might have chosen silence that first morning, the way everyone else in the diner had chosen silence, allowing cruelty to pass unchallenged simply because confronting it felt uncomfortable or inconvenient. She thought, too, about Arthur's quiet strength throughout the entire ordeal, his willingness to forgive even those who had wronged him most deeply, his steady belief that people carried within themselves the capacity for genuine change, if only given patience and opportunity to discover it. His example had shaped her own understanding of courage and compassion in ways she suspected would influence her for the rest of her life. That evening, as Grace prepared to close the diner, Arthur lingered near the entrance longer than usual, watching the golden light of sunset spill across the quiet street outside. "Thank you," he said simply, turning to face her one final time before heading home. "For seeing me when so many others chose not to." "Thank you," Grace replied, "for teaching me what real strength looks like." They shared a warm smile, two people whose lives had been permanently transformed by a single moment of courage neither of them had fully understood the significance of at the time. Arthur stepped out into the cool evening air, walking steadily toward his home on Maple Street, no longer weighed down by the invisible burden of loneliness that had once followed him like a persistent shadow. Behind him, Miller's Diner glowed warmly against the darkening sky, its lights spilling out onto the sidewalk, a small beacon of kindness in an ordinary town, forever changed by the quiet, extraordinary courage of one young woman who had simply refused to look away. Spring arrived earlier than usual that year, and with it came the long-awaited return of Claire and her family to the small town where Arthur had lived his entire life. Grace stood beside him on the day they arrived, having been invited to share in the moment as though she were already considered part of the family, a role she had earned through months of unwavering friendship and loyalty. Claire embraced her father tightly the moment she stepped out of the car, her two teenage children hanging back shyly, uncertain how to greet a grandfather they barely remembered from early childhood visits. Arthur knelt slowly, his knees protesting the movement, and opened his arms wide toward his grandchildren, his eyes shining with tears of pure joy. "I have been waiting a very long time for this," he said softly, and within moments both children rushed forward into his embrace, any earlier hesitation dissolving completely. Grace watched from a respectful distance, her own eyes glistening with happy tears, reflecting on how far Arthur had come from the lonely, invisible figure who once sat silently in a corner booth, enduring cruelty without complaint, because he had convinced himself that nobody would ever care enough to intervene. Claire found a moment to speak privately with Grace later that afternoon, her expression warm with genuine gratitude. "I don't know how to properly thank you," she said. "You gave me my father back, not just his safety but his spirit, his joy. I had not heard him sound this happy in years, not since before my mother passed." "He gave me just as much in return," Grace said honestly. "He taught me patience and forgiveness, and the kind of quiet strength I hope to carry with me for the rest of my life." Over the following months, Arthur's home filled once again with the sounds of laughter and family, his grandchildren visiting frequently after school, eager to hear his stories about bridges and engineering, about the town's history, about the grandmother they wished they had known better before her passing. Arthur relished every moment, embracing his role as grandfather with the same quiet dedication he had once poured into his life's work. Tyler and Kevin's transformation continued to deepen as well, both young men eventually expanding their volunteer efforts into a small nonprofit organization dedicated to supporting elderly residents throughout the county, an initiative Arthur himself helped establish, drawing upon decades of community connections and his own first-hand understanding of the isolation so many older individuals silently endured. The organization grew steadily, eventually partnering with local schools to organize regular visits between students and elderly residents, fostering exactly the kind of intergenerational connection that had once been missing from Arthur's own life, before Grace's simple act of courage changed everything. Miller's Diner remained a cherished gathering place throughout the community, its reputation for warmth and genuine hospitality drawing visitors from neighboring towns curious to witness the now well-known story firsthand. Daniel Foss often remarked, with quiet pride, that the diner had become something far greater than a simple business, transforming instead into a living reminder of the difference one person's courage could make when confronted with injustice. Grace eventually pursued additional training in hospitality management, encouraged by both Daniel and Arthur to consider opening her own establishment someday, one built upon the same principles of dignity and respect that had defined her time at Miller's Diner. She often visited Arthur on her days off, the two of them sharing quiet afternoons filled with easy conversation, his continued mentorship shaping her understanding of leadership, compassion, and the quiet responsibility that came with treating every person, regardless of age or circumstance, with genuine respect. Nora Fielding's extended news segment eventually earned regional recognition, drawing attention to the broader issue of elder isolation and inspiring similar community initiatives in neighboring towns across the state. Arthur, initially reluctant to embrace such widespread attention, gradually came to accept his unexpected role as an advocate for elderly dignity, speaking occasionally at community events and local schools, always emphasizing the same simple message that had defined his own remarkable journey. "It costs nothing to see the people around you," he would tell audiences, his voice steady and clear despite his advancing years. "It costs nothing to offer a kind word, a warm greeting, a moment of genuine attention." Yet these simple gestures carry more power than most people ever realize. The power to remind another human being that they still matter, that their presence in this world still holds value, regardless of how many years they have lived or how quiet their daily existence has become. As the years continued to pass, Arthur Whitfield lived out the remainder of his life surrounded by the very community that had once overlooked him so completely. His final years filled with the warmth of family, genuine friendship, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing his story had inspired countless others to choose kindness over indifference, courage over silence, and connection over the comfortable distance that so often allows cruelty to persist unchallenged. Grace never forgot the lesson she learned that first difficult morning, carrying it with her throughout every stage of her own life and career. She often told the story to new employees whenever she eventually opened her own small restaurant years later, always ending with the same simple reminder that had guided her own transformation from an uncertain young waitress into a woman capable of standing firmly for what she believed was right. Sometimes, she would tell them, the smallest act of courage, a single voice raised in defense of someone forgotten by the world, can change far more than anyone could ever predict. It can restore a broken spirit, transform a cruel heart, and remind an entire community that dignity belongs to everyone, regardless of age, regardless of circumstance, and regardless of how quietly a person has learned to endure the world's careless disregard. And in the end, that simple truth remained the enduring legacy of an ordinary morning in a small town diner, when one old man was mocked and one young woman refused to look away.